sit at the dais.
Is it ready to go? Right? What time is it?
We're ready.
Is that clock
It's
right?
a little,
Ready to go, right?
yeah.
The Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change will now come to order. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. This morning, the subcommittee will examine H.R. 3006, the Renewable Fuel Standard Integrity Act of 2019, a bipartisan bill sponsored by Congressman Cullen Peterson of Minnesota. Last Congress, Mr. Shimkus led a series of hearings and roundtables, taking a deep dive into EPA's Renewable Fuel Standard program. While the subcommittee covered many aspects of the RFS, the growing use of small refinery exemptions was an area we did not fully explore. Today is an opportunity to provide oversight regarding the recent rise of these waivers and the administration's overall implementation of the program. Based on our previous hearings, nearly everyone seems to agree that there have been challenges in the past with implementation, including setting an appropriate and timely annual renewable volume obligation, or an RVO. I also believe most would agree that small refinery exemptions are a legitimate part of the program. Refineries processing less than 75,000 barrels per day that believe they are experiencing disproportionate hardship due to the program can petition for these waivers. During the Obama administration, EPA followed the Department of Energy's advice on which waivers to grant. This resulted in numerous years with fewer than 10 exemptions granted annually. Often half of the petitions or more were rejected. It is also indisputable that we have seen a change in how petitions are being evaluated and granted. That change coincides with the beginning of the Trump administration. For 2016, some 19 waivers were granted. Just one was denied. For 2017, 35 waivers were granted and one denied. And for 2018, there were 31 granted and 6 denied. As more information has come out about these exemptions, it has become clear that EPA's actions are no longer aligned with DOE's recommendations. H.R. 3006 seeks to bring needed transparency into the process. The bill would set an annual deadline of June 1st for small refineries to petition for exemptions for that following year. Setting this deadline will mean granting waivers before the RVO is set, which would end the current retroactive process that has generated uncertainty in the RIN market. In order for the RIN market to function and properly incentivize investment, particularly in advanced biofuel production, it is critical that all market participants are receiving the same information and signals. The bill would also require public disclosure of any information included in exemption petitions. While I understand there are legitimate issues around confidential business information in these applications, surely there is some information that we can all agree would be appropriate to release. This includes details as innocuous as petitioners' names and locations of facilities receiving those exemptions. There is no good reason this very basic info should be treated as a trade secret. Currently, we do not know which or even how many facilities are receiving exemptions until long after they do. For a program that relies on trading to enable compliance, it is unbelievable that the program's regulator would give some participants market-driving information that can be traded on while everyone else is left in the dark. I do not think that it is a good or fair way for the RIN market to operate, and it certainly leads to greater volatility in RIN prices. The original goals of the RFS are still needed today, from supporting economic development in rural communities to developing domestic biofuel production, especially for advanced and cellulosic biofuels. The recent use of small refinery exemptions is failing to advance these goals. The administration is undermining market signals and certainty, which ultimately hurts rural communities. Adding greater certainty and transparency to the RIN market and the RFS more broadly is a necessary and valuable improvement. I look forward to hearing the perspectives of our witnesses on whether H.R. 3006 can help achieve those objectives. And so I do thank our witnesses for joining us today. I do want to also speak to the fact that we may be joined by many other members of the House on different committees. I want to recognize the presence of those as they join us, the colleagues from our committee who will be joining us for our hearing this morning. We're happy to have them here and welcome them to the committee. This is an important hearing, and it's always good to see members so motivated on an issue of importance to their constituents and to our nation. I do want to remind our guests, if they do choose to come, and our committee members, that while the rules of the House allow for our colleagues to join us, those rules also prohibit them from speaking or otherwise actively participating in our hearing. I also want to remind our committee members that it is also not in order to yield time to any of our colleagues who are not also members of this committee. And again, we will welcome them if they join us today. We appreciate the participation. With that, I will now recognize Mr. Shimkus, our ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. And welcome, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I want to welcome you back, all of you all back, to the Renewable Fuel Standard debate and extend a hearty welcome to all the new members of the subcommittee that haven't had the pleasure of trying to sort through the complexities of this issue prior to today. Quite frankly, I'm surprised we're having any hearing at all whose title speaks to protecting the Renewable Fuel Standard when last fall it was suggested that the federal government should be advancing policies to reduce demand and reliance on liquid fuels, the thrust of the RFS, because the transportation sector is now the greatest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and climate policy must address it. So I want to set the stage. Last year, my friend said we ought to get out of the liquid fuel debate, period, because of climate. Now we're here talking about protecting it. It's a dystopia that I'm experiencing right now. Moreover, while I think it is fair to have an oversight hearing about the RFS, I would caution folks, like our hearing title suggests, making comments about the uniqueness of the situation. I want to associate myself with Mr. Tomico's comments from last fall that for several years we've heard about issues with implementing the Renewable Fuel Standard program under administrations from both parties. For this reason, simply saving the RFS is not only a misnomer, it does a disservice to the many stakeholders impacted by this program. I would like to take this opportunity to renew my plea for this committee and the affected stakeholders to take a very serious look at the high-octane proposal that Congressman Flores and I have recently reintroduced. Even though we are both not seeking re-election, we think status quo with this program is not sustainable. Given the Energy Department's Energy Information Administration projections of declining liquid transportation fuel demand, it's difficult to envision a post-2022 scenario in which biofuel volumes would not actually be lower than they are today. In addition, while it is true that the Renewable Fuel Standard does not disappear in 2023, the rules for allocation change quite a bit depending upon who is in office and what that administrator considers appropriate for the disparate interests involved in this issue. If you're looking for certainty, this is not a recipe for it. On top of that, just as Congress guessed wrong in 2007 on the levels and types of fuels that would be in the marketplace a decade or more later, we cannot predict market forces or trade impacts or other political pressures on allocations, nor should Congress repeat the error of making fuel choices during any major change in auto technology, fuel efficiency regulation, and a push for removing liquid and higher carbon-based fuels from the marketplace. Rather than looking at individual federal transportation fuel policies on their own, I urge my colleagues, as we have done in a high-octane proposal, to take a wider view of those policies and consider how they might, using rather than manipulating the marketplace, work together to bring more value to consumers and more certainty to stakeholders. Our bill would transition from blend-specific mandates to performance-based standards for future fuels and vehicles, remove long-standing barriers to the availability and usability of higher ethanol blends, provide an additional decade of certainty for advanced biofuels, and harmonize EPA and DOT vehicle efficiency programs. It's time that Congress pursue this type of comprehensive reform. Stakeholders on all sides of this debate have been whipsawed for months by rumored and actual administration actions. Media reports and legal actions and the uncertainty will only increase after 2022, when EPA receives even broader discretion to set biofuel blending requirements. I welcome the witnesses today and their organizations back to the committee. I hope you will provide us with a constructive and hopefully objective and productive dialogue. And with that, I'd like to yield my remaining of my time to Mr. Flores, my colleague and friend from Texas.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. At a hearing last December on the 21st Century Transportation Fuels Act, I outlined some basic concerns with respect to the status quo. of America's current fuel policies. Number one, biofuel producers consistently raise concerns about the annual implementation of the RFS. Number two, refiners face increased cost of complying with the RFS, and those costs are borne by consumers. Number three, automakers face challenges in complying with the efficiency programs under two different agencies inside the EPA and the DOT. And fourth, some environmental communities believe that first-generation ethanol creates environmental problems. Almost 11 months since that hearing, we're back on the same room fighting over the same RFS. The 21st Century Transportation Fuels Act, developed after several bipartisan roundtables and hearings, addressed many of these concerns by taking a holistic view of our transportation fuel policies. For consumers, higher octane fuels can bring increased efficiency and performance for the next generation of engines. For stakeholders, transitioning the RFS to a national octane standard creates new market opportunity for biofuel producers and gives compliance certainty to refiners and automakers. Mr. Shimkus and I have reintroduced this bill on October the 16th, and as I've said before, we can either go with the status quo, which almost everybody has said is broken, or we can have a compromise solution like the 21st Century Fuels Act. I can guarantee all of you in this room, and they're listening, that we're not going to find a perfect solution that gives everybody 100% of what they want. With that, I look forward to questioning our witnesses. I yield back the balance of my time.
And Mr. Shimkus yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Chairman Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Today, this committee is continuing its oversight of the Trump administration by examining the EPA's abuse of secret waivers to undermine the Renewable Fuel Standard Program, or RFS. Right now, President Trump is pitting farmers and refiners against each other to the detriment of all stakeholders and consumers. As a result, the RFS does not appear to be working the way it should for anyone involved. Last Congress, then Chairman Shimkus held a series of roundtables and hearings on the RFS in a quest to try to determine a new course for the program going forward. And while I disagree with the proposal he developed, his efforts were sincere, and the hearings illuminated many important issues that we must deal with as we approach 2022 and the sunsetting of the current phase of the program. Unfortunately, President Trump does not seem interested in making the program work. In fact, the Trump administration has done its best to undermine the program at a time when American farmers are already struggling to deal with the collapse of markets for many of the products they grow here at home. The idea that EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler is somehow acting without the president's knowledge or approval defies logic. As we've seen throughout the last 3 years, anyone in the administration who acts against President Trump's stated desires is either subject to a public browbeating or they're dismissed from the administration. So it's clear that Administrator Wheeler is acting on the president's orders that once again show President Trump as captive to the oil industry. Nowhere is this more evident than the president's huge expansion of small refinery waivers. Before President Trump had taken office, EPA normally approved around 7 or 8 petitions for these waivers each year. But that changed dramatically when Trump came to office. Former Administrator Pruitt retroactively approved 19 exemptions for 2016, and then 35 were approved for 2017, followed by 31 in 2018. And I think it's fair to say that some exemptions to the law's renewable fuel blending requirements are necessary, and that there are refineries that would be harmed without an exemption. In New Jersey, we have a number of small refineries, and these waivers can be important for a struggling facility. But unfortunately, today we have no way of knowing whether any of the refineries granted these exemptions are actually experiencing the hardship envisioned by Congress when we created the RFS. And it's a frustration shared by both Democrats and Republicans. Senator Grassley has said, and I quote, he's very skeptical that every company receiving waivers truly needs them. And this skepticism is completely understandable considering these hardship exemptions are granted in secret, with EPA not even revealing the name of the companies that received them. Not even our committee, which created the RFS, receives that information. And there's simply no transparency in the process, and these decisions are far too consequential to be made in the dark back room without any sunlight. So that's why today we're holding a hearing on these exemptions, and specifically on Representative Peterson's bipartisan legislation to bring at least part of this process out into the open. H.R. 3006, the Renewable Fuel Standard Integrity Act of 2019, requires public disclosure of any information included in petitions for exemption from the annual blending requirements. The bill also sets an annual deadline of June 1st for small refineries to petition for exemption from the upcoming year's blending requirements in order to make the process more predictable and rational. Now, some of the information contained in the small refinery exemption petitions is likely to be confidential business information that shouldn't be divulged to the general public, but there's clearly a logical middle ground between releasing every bit of information on a petition and the complete blackout that we're all subject to today. So we should be able to find a middle ground and move a version of this bill through the committee with bipartisan support, and that's what we're hoping to achieve today. And I thank you again, Chairman Tonko. This, I think, is a very important hearing. Thank you. I yield back.
You're welcome. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Congressman Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, thank you for being here. I understand today's hearing has multiple objectives. It's a legislative hearing on H.R. 3006, the Renewable Fuel Standard Integrity Act. It's an oversight hearing of both small refinery exemptions and the recent supplemental proposed rule on required production of certain renewable fuels. I'm sure H.R. 3006 is a well-meaning attempt to address concerns that biofuel and feedstock producers have about the issuance of waivers, but I have questions about the legislation. From my reading, I'm confused about the timing between the deadline for requesting a waiver and the rules establishing required volumes. I'm also troubled by the broadness of the precedent the bill sets in removing protections for any legitimate trade sector intellectual property submitted to EPA as part of a waiver. I hope our witnesses can help us understand whether this bill needs changes to be workable and whether they would consider this a good policy if it applied to them. As the EPA's recent supplemental proposal on the required production amounts for certain biofuels in 2020 and 2021 and its administration of the small refinery waiver, I wish we had a witness from the EPA here to explain its logic for proposing the change calculations of renewable fuel percentages, how that will ensure industry blends what's intended, and required volumes are not reduced by future hardship waivers. Now, I understand the EPA offered alternate dates to appear before our committee, but considering the EPA is holding a public hearing on this subject tomorrow, and then we'll be taking comment for another 30 days, it seems it would have been prudent for the committee to postpone long enough for us to engage in meaningful oversight. But this is hardly the only issue with the RFS. A broader hearing on the entire program seems like it would have been a more appropriate way to tackle this. Take renewable fuels sourced from woody biomass, something I've talked about for years and actually is occurring in my district or will soon. Not only can woody biomass produce the most desired yet least produced fuel under the RFS, it also helps thin our forests and reduce the risk of catastrophic fire that pumps carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Despite these advantages, RFS treats wood from private and federal land differently, even though there's no scientific difference. This is a missed opportunity. If we're serious about expanding renewable fuels and further lowering carbon emissions, we cannot establish arbitrary conditions and be so narrowly focused on who owns the wood. We need innovation, preparation, and conservation-based solutions. Let me be clear, though, the RFS is important to many people, particularly in a time of uncertainty in commodity markets. If we're going to look at this program seriously, we should do it in a way that's broader and improves the program for consumers and not just incumbent producers. Finally, let me say something about the most obvious part of this hearing. We're holding a hearing on the need for more bio-based liquid transportation fuels when every other indication from the majority, whether talking points, its ill-defined 100 by 50 proposal, of which we have many questions, the Green New Deal or the LIFT Act, each revolve around doing away with liquid fuels to power light-duty and heavy-duty vehicles fuel mix. Based on this policy desire and Department of Energy data showing a decline in the use of liquid fuels, it's perplexing that we have this hearing to promote the use of liquid fuels and the renewable fuels standard at the same time. It's promoting policies against continued use of these fuels. Now, in the last Congress, I tasked Mr. Shimkus and Mr. Flores with the tough duty of coming together to see if we could figure a way through this for a modern RFS system, and well, you know what happened. First, Mr. Shimkus announced he's not running again, then Mr. Flores announced he's not running again, and then I announced I'm not running again. So it's a hell of a mess. But it's one that I would caution anybody who wants to get close to, and you dropped out too.
I'm running again.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just warning anybody on the committee, stay away from RFS. But it's a tough one. We all know that. Lots of competing interests, and I think we all want to get it right, Mr. Chairman. So, as always, we look forward to working with you, sir, and as this moves forward. And I yield back.
Well, we appreciate those comments and the warnings. And the warnings. The gentleman yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. Now we will introduce our witnesses, and we welcome them all for joining us on what is a very important discussion. We'll begin with Mr. Jeff Cooper, President and CEO of Renewable Fuels Association. Seated next to him is Mr. Gene Gibolis, President and CEO of World Energy. Next to him, Mr. Chet Thompson, President and CEO of American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. And then finally, Mr. Kelly New-Wenhouse, President of Siouxland Energy Cooperative. Before we begin, gentlemen, I would like to explain the lighting system. In front of you are a series of lights. The light will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. Please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn red when your time has expired. At this time, the chair will now recognize Mr. Cooper for 5 minutes to provide his opening statement. And again, welcome, Mr. Cooper.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, Ranking Member Walden, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jeff Cooper, and I am the President and CEO of the Renewable Fuels Association, a trade association representing the U.S. ethanol industry. I appreciate the opportunity to share our industry's concerns regarding EPA's rampant abuse of RFS small refinery exemptions, or SREs. When properly implemented, the Renewable Fuel Standard is an extraordinary program. It decreases reliance on imported petroleum, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, lowers gas prices, and boosts the economy. The RFS achieves these goals by ensuring that biofuels are afforded access to a fuel market that is otherwise closed to competition. Unfortunately, the current administration's approach to implementation has destabilized the RFS and created significant uncertainty in the marketplace. Specifically, EPA's flagrant abuse of SREs has resulted in lower production and use of ethanol, increased emissions, higher gas prices, and lost jobs. In recent years, EPA has granted an unprecedented number of SREs and disregarded the established requirements for eligibility. SREs were intended to be temporary, meaning there should be fewer exemptions granted each year as more small refineries come into compliance. Further, exemptions were meant to be available only to refineries that demonstrate compliance with the RFS itself would cause them disproportionate economic hardship, something that would be incredibly difficult for any refinery to show today, given historically low RIN prices and the fact that compliance costs are fully passed through to the refiner's customers. Under the current administration, EPA has granted an average of 28 SREs per year, eroding renewable fuel blending requirements by an average of 1.35 billion gallons annually. That compares to just 7 SREs per year on average and a reduction in the RFS requirements of just 230 million gallons under the previous administration. So we've seen a 4-fold increase in the number of exemptions granted and a 6-fold increase in the volume of exemptions granted. The dramatic increase in SREs has resulted in demand destruction and some of the worst market conditions in the industry's history. The RFS was intended to continually grow the volume of domestic ethanol consumption, but unfortunately the demand increase promised by the RFS has not materialized due to the SREs. After 22 straight years of successive increases, U.S. ethanol demand in 2018 fell from 2017 levels. And before the massive increase in SREs, U.S. ethanol consumption for this year, 2019, was expected by EIA to top out at above 14.8 billion gallons. EIA now expects 2019 consumption will be closer to 14.3 billion gallons, so a loss of 500 million gallons of demand. Ethanol consumption would have fallen even further if not for the dramatic downward adjustment in ethanol prices. Ethanol had to maintain competitiveness, and so prices fell. And as prices fell, net returns at ethanol plants deteriorated to the lowest levels since at least 2007. Facing weak or negative margins, ethanol plants have been forced to idle or permanently shutter. We have seen 19 ethanol plants, at least 19 plants, idle or closed since spring of 2018 when this issue really began. When an ethanol plant goes down, the local community suffers. We're talking about lost jobs. We're talking about a reduction of 20 to 25 cents per bushel in corn prices. We estimate that, with these 19 plants that have recently idled or closed, we're talking about 700 direct jobs that have been lost and about 2,800 jobs indirectly that have been affected in related sectors. Unfortunately, EPA's recent supplemental proposal, which was intended to implement a relief package promised by President Trump, fails to correct these problems. The bait and switch employed by EPA in this latest proposal does not ensure that the statutory volume for conventional biofuels will be enforced in 2020 or beyond, and we think it is likely the 2020 requirement for conventional biofuels could again be eroded to less than 15 billion gallons. In short, EPA's proposal will not bring idle plants back online, and it won't put furloughed workers back to work. I want to close by expressing RFA's strong support for H.R. 3006, where I come from would call that 30-06, which begins to resolve some of the problems we are discussing today. The bill would ensure EPA's final RVOs are actually enforced and not eroded by SREs. The bill also contains important provisions that would greatly enhance transparency. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
You're most welcome, and thank you for your presentation. Now we'll recognize Mr. Gabolis for 5 minutes for your opening statement, please.
Good morning, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, and members of the committee. I'm Gene Gabolis, President and CEO of World Energy, one of the largest and longest-standing advanced biofuels suppliers in North America. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today on behalf of the National Biodiesel Board and the 65,000 workers associated with America's biomass-based diesel industry, who collectively generate $17 billion in economic activity, dramatically reduce our nation's reliance on fossil fuels, and substantially lighten the national carbon footprint. On August 9th, the Environmental Protection Agency announced that it had waived renewable fuel standard requirements for another 31 refineries, bringing the total issued in just the last 2 years alone to 85. The move ensured that over 4 billion gallons of biofuels would be replaced by fossil fuels in the national fuel tank, adding more than 20 million tons of carbon back into the atmosphere. For an agency whose namesake mission is environmental protection, these moves are not only alarming, but fully perplexing. For years, the EPA had routinely issued 7 or 8 waivers a year, totaling a couple 100 million gallons in total impact. But now, the most recent waiver deluge set off a wave of plant closures impacting thousands of workers in biofuels, agriculture, and related industries. On August 16th, 1 week after the EPA announcement, I had to tell our employees, suppliers, and the communities where we work that we were shutting down production at our plants in Rome, Georgia, Natchez, Mississippi, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, as a direct result of the EPA's misuse of its small refinery exemption authority. Our closures alone impacted more than 100 workers directly and many hundreds more indirectly. An analysis conducted at the University of Illinois found that small refinery exemptions issued over just the last 2 years have slashed demand for biomass-based diesel by over 2 billion gallons, with the economic damage expected to reach $7.7 billion. The blowback to the latest round of waivers has been swift and widespread, and by the end of August, President Trump promised a giant package to address the problems stemming from EPA's excessive use of waivers. On October 4th, the White House announced that a deal had been reached to use an average of the gallons exempted over the previous 3 years to estimate expected 2020 waivers and establishing the renewable fuel volume obligations for the coming year. While the deal would not make up for the billions of gallons of advanced biofuels demand already lost, if implemented correctly, it promised to soften the blow of exemptions in the future. Now, the EPA has offered its proposed solution, in the form of a supplemental rulemaking. And regrettably, it falls woefully short of the President's advanced billing. Again, the EPA has gone astray. Now, instead of taking the average of the waivers EPA actually granted over the last 3 years, the agency is proposing to offset in 2020 the average volume that the Department of Energy originally recommended that the EPA grant. Why? Because what DOE advised is dramatically lower than what EPA has actually done. Now we know what we suspected all along, that EPA ignored DOE recommendations and handed out nearly twice as much waiver volume as DOE had recommended. As hard as that is to fathom, it's harder still to understand why it would make sense for EPA to now go back to the very same DOE recommendations it blatantly ignored to account for next year's proposed waivers. The agency is doing nothing to assure that they will discontinue the practice of promoting compliance avoidance over compliance, and is doing little to establish RFS stakeholder confidence that the agency intends to chart a new course based on the plain intent of Congress to grow the nation's use of advanced biofuels. EPA's job is to administer the law Congress enacted, not to rewrite it. EPA must be held to account to do the public's bidding in public. There should be nothing secretive about who gets waivers, why they get them, and for how many gallons the relief is provided. There is absolutely nothing confidential about the damage our industry is experiencing. How can it be reasonable that those seeking non-compliance can be allowed to continue to lurk in EPA's shadows when those of us impacted by their actions have nowhere to hide? When EPA finalizes its 2020 renewable fuel obligations rule by the end of this year, it must fully account for small refinery exemptions, those actually given, not those recommended but ignored. The agency must recognize and support the biodiesel industry's ability to grow under the RFS in 2020 and beyond, as Congress intended. The war on biofuels and agriculture must end. It's time for the secret waiver program to be brought into the light and for EPA to reestablish public trust.
Thank you, Mr. Cabolas. And next, we'll move to Mr. Thompson. You're recognized for 5 minutes with your opening statement, please.
Good morning, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus. Let me turn my microphone on, and the rest of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify.
And if you could just move the mic closer to you.
I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and to share the views of AFPM on the topics of today's latest RFS hearing. My members produce the gasoline, the diesel, the jet fuel, and other products that make modern life possible, as well as 20% of U.S. ethanol and a substantial amount of renewable diesel. My members are obligated parties under the RFS and hence are directly impacted by this program, SREs, H.R. 3006, and EPA's recent supplemental proposal. This morning, I'd like to highlight just a few of the points made in my written testimony. First, our nation's more than 50 small refiners are national security assets. They're critical sources of our fuel supply. They employ tens of thousands of women and men across the country, and they are the lifebloods of communities, again, all across the country. This very body, Congress, recognized the importance of these refineries and the threat posed to them by the RFS. Thus, Congress first exempted small refineries from the program outright, and then allowed small refineries to seek waivers, quote, at any time, and instructed EPA to grant them upon a showing of a disproportionate economic hardship. As predicted by DOE as far back as 2011, the RFS's rising mandates and the emergence of the blend wall has created hardships for the entire refining industry, but particularly small refineries. Rising RIN and compliance costs of the RFS is what explains the rise in SREs in recent years. Second, as the graphs on the chart on the screen show, the notion that SREs are hurting biofuel market share is false. EIA data, the government's own data, demonstrate that biofuel consumption and blending are at or near all-time highs. Third, H.R. 3006 would be bad for small refineries, bad for their workforce, and bad for consumers all across the country. Requiring facilities to apply for waivers months before EPA has even finalized, and in some cases probably even proposed the RVO, and requiring that all supporting financial data be publicly disclosed would effectively eliminate this very critical, important safety net, again, one established by Congress. It would be challenging to make the requisite showing of disproportionate hardship without knowing some pretty key information, such as the volume of the mandate in the particular year and the price of RINs. Having one fixed application date as well as proposed on June 1st would deprive facilities of the ability to seek waivers in response to the many unforeseen circumstances that can arise in a given year. And as you know, waiver applications require very sensitive financial data, such as profitability, cash flow and balances, refining margins, debt, loan covenants, and business plans. Mandating that that all this information be publicly released, which is exactly what H.R. 3006 would do, would create a Hobson's choice for small refiners. Forego the waiver and experience the disproportionate hardship caused by the RFS, or apply for the waiver and grant your competition into an ability to exploit your financial weaknesses. It is clear that the real purpose of H.R. 3006 is certainly not to reform the waiver process, but to eliminate it. For this reason, we cannot and do not support it. AFPM similarly opposes EPA's supplemental proposal. This supplemental proposal is unfair to non-exempt refineries and unnecessary to maintain the robust demand for domestic biofuels, as the chart on the screen shows. Its only beneficiary would be foreign biofuel producers. Finally, we continue to support smarter fuel policies that can really help all stakeholders. That is why we testified twice before this very committee last year about the great potential of transitioning away from the RFS to a 95 RON octane standard. By better optimizing fuels and engines, we can increase vehicle efficiency at a lower cost, increase market-driven potential for biofuels, and reduce compliance costs for refineries. As refiners and as producers, as I said, 20% of the U.S. ethanol, we believe 95 RON would be a win for all stakeholders and for the environment. So to that end, we appreciate the efforts of Congressman Shimkus and Flores to advance that discussion, and they will be missed. We also support near-term bipartisan legislation by Congressman Flores and Welch that recognizes the blend wall and sets volumes based on what the market we have today rather than the one that was incorrectly projected more than a decade ago. With that, I thank you again for being here, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson, and welcome again. And finally, Mr. Neuwenhuis, you are recognized for 5 minutes, and appreciate your testimony.
Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Kelly Neuwenhuis. I've been farming for 37 years with my brothers and father near Primgar, Iowa. We grow corn and soybeans on our family farming operation, and roughly 95% of the corn we produce goes to ethanol. I also serve as president of Siouxland Energy Cooperative. I'm taking time away from harvest because today's topic is critically important. Plain and simple, the EPA's abuse of small refinery exemptions under the RFS is crippling rural America. I've seen this firsthand as president of Siouxland Energy, a farmer-owned ethanol plant in Sioux Center, Iowa. Each year, our plant produces up to 80 million gallons of clean, renewable biofuel, including up to 2 million gallons a year of cellulosic ethanol. Because of the EPA's actions to help the oil industry's bottom line at the expense of farmers and the biofuels producers, we had to make a hard decision to idle our plant and shut off a key market for hundreds of local farmers, including myself. The morning we announced that we were idling our plant, I was tasked with delivering the bad news to our 42 employees. The team sat quietly, wondering about their future in the event we would have to permanently close our facility. This is one of the toughest things I have ever had to do. Even 8 years ago, during a 50-year drought, our plant had significantly more debt than we do today, and yet we had no problem accessing capital. This time around, our local bank increased the scrutiny for borrowing, given the lack of certainty with the RFS. The reality is that they read the same news that we read, and they understand the EPA is taking actions that have dramatically undermined the market. The economic crisis created by the EPA's abuse of SREs started 3 years ago. At first, we couldn't put a finger on what it was, but the fundamentals in our markets seemed off. It was only after the press started reporting the rapid escalation of SREs being granted behind closed doors by the EPA that we began to understand what was happening to our business. I'm a simple numbers guy. In 2018, if the integrity of the RFS was upheld and we blended 15 billion gallons of ethanol, coupled with the 1.7 billion gallons of exports, that's 16.7 billion gallons of ethanol demand. That year, the U.S. ethanol industry set a record production of 16.1 billion gallons. If the RFS had been upheld, then today we'd be growing this industry. A few weeks ago, we did get a small piece of good news for our plant at Siouxland Energy. The state of California is using a significant amount of ethanol to meet its requirements under the low carbon fuel standard, and CARB lowered our plant's carbon score by roughly 10%, giving us a new market opportunity. As a result, now we're back online and operating at 50% capacity. So we're only losing slightly less money than we would be if our whole plant was idle. This small boost came directly from California, not the EPA. The regulatory attempts by the EPA give us little confidence that we will see the relief we need. That's why the agricultural and biofuels industries strongly support H.R. 3006, the Rfs Integrity Act, sponsored by Representatives Colin Peterson and Dusty Johnson. This bill would address the EPA's dismal record on SRE transparencies. We have no idea of the specifics used by DOE or EPA in making SRE decisions. And this bill takes care of these basic transparency concerns by setting a reasonable deadline for SRE applications and giving the public greater insight on this murky process. On behalf of our employees and the ethanol producers, thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Neuenhaus, and thank you again to our panel for your contributions here this morning. We'll now move to member questions, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Cooper, let's begin with you. Can you briefly explain the relationship between SRE approvals and RIN prices?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly can. I think the clearest example of the impact of small refinery exemptions on RIN prices really occurred in the first quarter and second quarter of 2018. Prior to that, if you looked at the late 2017, early 2018, we had RIN prices for ethanol, D6 RINs, that were trading in the 80 to 90 cent per gallon range. That was really stimulating investment in downstream infrastructure for higher blends. It was stimulating growth in production. When the public and the marketplace became aware of this first massive round of SREs from former Administrator Pruitt, RIN prices tanked immediately, and we went from 80 or 90 cents to about 20 cents for RIN prices virtually overnight. And we've been at that low level around 20 cents or below for RIN prices really ever since the first or second quarter of 2018. That's had a dramatic impact on the investment signal for downstream retailers and blenders. And it's had, obviously a significant impact on the incentive to produce ethanol as well. We're seeing plants close down and seeing reduced output rates as well, and we point to the drop in RIN prices as partly responsible for that.
Thank you. And what role does the RVO play in providing a signal to market participants from the refineries all the way over to the biofuel producers?
Well, in the past, when the marketplace had faith that the RVO was a real number, it sent a strong signal, and it would, you know, if the RVO was interpreted by the marketplace as a number that was going to be hard to meet, RIN prices reacted, and you would see strong RIN prices, and they would do their job to kind of force more biofuel into the marketplace. Today, we have a situation where nobody in the marketplace views the RVO, the annual number, as a real number, because they know it's going to be eroded and undermined by these retroactive small refinery exemptions. So when EPA last fall published a 15 billion gallon requirement for conventional biofuels in 2019, the market barely blinked. The market barely reacted because nobody believes the number's real.
Thank you. And Mr. Gabolas, your company has existed and grown since the RFS began. Is having confidence and certainty in the RVO important for investments and business decisions that you've made?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. The big investment that we're working on right now is our renewable aviation fuel and renewable diesel facility in Los Angeles. We've announced a project to expand capacity there substantially. We'll be investing hundreds of millions of dollars. We're making that investment because of California legislation, not because of the federal legislation. At our plant in Houston, Texas, where we have been working on a substantial expansion, we've had to put that project on hold because that project only serves the non-California market. So just by looking at those two facilities alone, we're spending money in California because California policy works. We're not spending money in Texas because federal policy doesn't work.
Thank you. And Mr. Neuenhaus, in regard to that RVO impact, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's definitely part of the certainty of the industry. You know, I talked about our financing at our local plant, and 8 years ago when we had a lot more debt, we had no problem with capital, and now with the fear of the RFS being undermined by these SREs and the RVO numbers not being where they're supposed to be, that's the uncertainty in the industry, and it's fearful.
Right. And Mr. Cooper, do you believe the RIN market manipulation is possible due to the current secrecy around the issuance of exemptions?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think there is a very clear correlation between the issuance of SREs and the reaction of the RIN market. And it's pretty clear that, at least in my opinion, you know, EPA is using the SRE program as a backdoor way of managing RIN prices and controlling RIN prices, which was clearly not something that anyone intended EPA to be doing. The RIN market was intended to operate freely to help, you know, help achieve the goals of the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is to grow the consumption and use of biofuels.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Shimkus for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our hearing title today suggests a desire to keep liquid fuels powering passenger cars and light vehicles for a long time, and I like that. Yet last week, Senator Schumer proposed $454 billion program to get all Americans out of their liquid fuel-powered vehicles and into electric-powered vehicles. Mr. Cooper and Mr. Neuenhuis, what would be the impact of this proposal on rural farm economies?
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. I think the impact of if we're talking about H.R. 3006.
No, we're talking about Senator Schumer's proposal last week to move all passenger vehicles to electric.
Okay, I think there's a broad understanding that even if that proposal were to be enacted, it would be very long-term transition. I think we all agree that we're going to be using liquid fuels for a very, very long time.
All right. I'm disappointed in that answer because it's a simple answer and a simple question. If we move to all electric vehicles, that's less liquid transportation fuels. Mr. Neuenhuis?
I guess I don't know a whole lot about the electric vehicle industry, but I do know the ethanol industry has been working for 40 years, and we're still working on infrastructure. and I can't see how the electric industry can change that infrastructure that fast. So I don't have.
What would it do based on your ability to sell a commodity product like ethanol if all our vehicle transportation fleet moves to electric? Do you have a market?
I don't know. I don't know that answer because I've seen a lot of.
Well, let me go to
I've seen a lot of information from.
let me go to Mr. Thompson. What would be the impact of such a proposal on unionized workers at your members' facilities?
It would obviously be very bad. Right now, we produce approximately 143 billion gallons of gasoline to supply today's transportation fleet. If it all went electric, that would go away. There is no ethanol used in an electric vehicle.
Would this be a good policy for consumers and taxpayers?
No, it would be a very bad policy. One only needs to look at the data out there of how much more expensive electric vehicles are. And certainly there's lots of research that show they're not better for the environment. I do not think it's better for consumers.
So let me go to Mr. Gabolis, because as we move in this debate on electric vehicles for passengers, and we've already had this in the heavy transportation hearing we had last week, there will be a movement to eventually go to electrify heavy-duty vehicles. What would that do to your market?
It would be a very long transition.
All right, I got that
Average
answer.
diesel vehicles on the road, sir, for 15
I know,
years.
we had a hearing last week, and the Port of Los Angeles is exploring electric heavy-duty vehicles that would get recharged halfway to the distribution center. Can you sell biodiesel to an electric vehicle?
We cannot.
Okay, thank you. 10 months ago, I asked many of your groups about the future of RFS. I stated, absent legislative action, the EPA will retain its waiver authority. Now, we're talking about certainty here, including the authority to exempt certain refiners from their obligations under the RFS, especially after 2022, when all agency loses its statutory biofuel targets in 2022. So if you can, give me a higher, lower, or the same. Given the Energy Information Agency projects 31% decrease in motor fuel consumption by 2017 to 2025, do you expect RVOs to be higher or lower post-2022 than they are today? Higher, lower, or the same if the Energy Information Agency predicts less liquid fuel use? Mr. Cooper.
Well, thank you. And the RFS is not a percentage-based program. It's
Higher, lower, or the same?
the same.
Okay, Mr. Gabolis.
The same.
Okay, Mr. Thompson.
Substantially lower.
Okay, and Mr. Neuenhuis.
The same.
Given that ethanol is such an overwhelming cheap octane enhancer, in addition to environmental benefits, wouldn't some refiners be more competitive if they were to opt for this lower cost of octane, Mr. Cooper?
Yes, I believe they would.
Mr. Thompson, seeing as your members are in competition against one another for the client business, to what extent do you think refiners would be influenced by market forces to use the cheapest source of octane, which is ethanol, in order to keep their product prices competitive?
Very influenced by that, which is why data shows that blend rates are as high as they've ever been today, even with the SREs. All the testimony that we've heard today is contradicted by EIA data that I put on the screen. This is the highest ethanol blend rates as a country we've ever had. And the reason for that is because my members make blend stocks that cannot be sold until the octane is added, and the cheapest source of octane is ethanol. That's why the data is not consistent with the testimony today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My time's expired.
Gentleman yields back. Before we go to our next member, want to recognize the presence of Congressman Dusty Johnson of South Dakota, who is co-sponsor of H.R. 3006, and we welcome him here today. Here we are welcome. And next, the chair will recognize Congressmember Barragan for 5 minutes for questions, please.
Well, thank you. I want to start off by being the member who represents the Port of Los Angeles and applauding them for their efforts to go electric. The district is one where we have high air pollution, and from everything I have seen, indicates that electric will help the environment, and so I wanted to take my opportunity to applaud them in their efforts. There's a lot of conversation about, oh, well, it doesn't go very far. When you take a look at distribution from the port and to the port, it's coming from the Inland Empire. That's not more than 150 miles. And so I just wanted to put that on the record, given this is a continuing issue I keep hearing about and the reference to the port. I want to start off by saying that I share the goal of many on this committee and on this panel to reduce America's dependence on oil. I also think it's reasonable to want predictability on EPA regulatory decisions, such as exemptions that alter the intent of our laws. However, I think we need a much broader conversation on the future of the renewable fuel standards. My district, as I mentioned, is 90% African American and Latino. It bears a great part of the burden of our dependence on fossil fuels. We have had to live with urban oil wells, liquefied petroleum gas facilities, Superfund sites, and under-regulated heavy industry. Consequently, we have had some of the highest asthma rates in the country, and it is one of the most heavily polluted districts in this country. No one wants America to move off of oil more than I do. However, we have to be mindful of the unintended consequences of the policies we are putting in place to bring us to a fossil fuel-free economy. The renewable fuel standards was well-intentioned, but we have since then learned from the EPA's own 2018 report titled Biofuels and the Environment, Second Triennial Report to Congress, that the increased demand for biofuels has driven land conversion here and abroad to biofuels to produce corn and soybeans and palm oil. This has led to the national and international land use changes that have replaced carbon sequestering and biodiverse natural landscapes and forests with large corn and soybean farms. Further, efforts to meet the advanced biofuel mandate has led to the importation of biofuels from palm oil in countries such as Indonesia, causing widespread deforestation. I hope that in the future this committee can take up the work of crafting a comprehensive evidence-based policy approach to reforming the renewable fuel standards. Building off that statement, I have a joint ProPublica investigative report and New York Times article titled "Palm Oil Was Supposed to Save the Planet. Instead, it unleashed a catastrophe." Stated November 20th, 2018. I'd like to request unanimous consent to enter it into the record. My question for the biofuel representatives on the panel is, what steps are you taking to make sure that you're not sourcing biofuels from land at home or abroad that has been converted from forest land or natural wilderness to farmland?
Well, thank you for the question. On the ethanol side, which I can comment on, the RFS law itself, the statute, the 2007 statute, includes a provision that specifically prohibits our member companies from using feedstock that was cultivated on land that wasn't already in cultivation at the date of enactment in 2007. If they were to do that, and EPA annually conducts an analysis to see if land has expanded, and if they find that it has as a consequence of the RFS, that triggers all sorts of new onerous requirements, reporting and record-keeping requirements for the industry. What EPA has found every single year when they do that analysis is that cropland is shrinking, and that the amount of cropland under cultivation today is lower than it was in 2007 when the act was passed, and far lower than it was 40, 50, 70, 100 years ago. So this narrative that we hear that the RFS is somehow driving expansion of cropland is not borne out in the data. It is not. There's no evidence of that. Now the EPA triennial report. There's modeling studies and economic modeling exercises, scenario analysis, and when you plug the right numbers in, yeah, it'll give you a scenario where cropland expands. The real world evidence shows that is not occurring, however. Certainly in terms of U.S. cropland, and frankly, globally, cropland expansion has not accelerated in the era of biofuels. The trend of cropland expansion globally is today what it was prior to passage of the RFS.
If I might just quickly add, the RFS specifically excludes the use of palm oil Soybeans are not grown for their oil, they're grown for their meal. And we use feedstocks that come from used cooking oil, animal fats, and oil that exists because we use protein from soy to feed animals and people.
And my time has expired. The issue is, I believe, not how much cropland there is. The issue is how much conversion has happened. I'm interested in that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, the gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Rogers from Washington State for 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank the panel for joining us today as we discuss the RFS and its future. I think it's important to be conscious of consumer demand and advances in vehicle technology and how that affects the fuel market. So I wanted to ask the panel, as automobiles and truck fleets turn over to more efficient vehicles, what will this do for the demand for fuels? Do the statutory blending goals of the RFS program still make sense when looking at the future of the transportation fleet? Now, maybe I'll just start right here and ask each one of you.
Well, happy to answer that question. And yes, I think as we look at the evolution of the light-duty vehicle fleet into more efficient internal combustion engines, those engines want and need, and the automakers are demanding, higher octane. Which Congressman Shimkus and Mr. Flores, of course, have been very much focused on. Ethanol is the highest, cleanest source of octane available, on the market. And so we think when you pair those two things, an RFS and a high-octane fuel standard, the RFS requirements do make sense long-term. They guarantee that the octane source for more fuel-efficient vehicles, higher octane, high compression ratio engines comes from biofuels and not from dirty hydrocarbons, which lead to the asthma problems that we just heard about in California.
Very good. Go on.
So my business works primarily on the diesel side of the equation. On the diesel side, the equipment tends to exist for a very long time. So the transition on the diesel side will be slow in coming. Progress will come, and that's a good thing. Vehicles should get more efficient. We should move to cleaner and better technologies over time. But we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. While we are transitioning to cleaner and better technologies, we have cleaner and better technologies today. Advanced biofuels are called advanced because they reduce carbon footprint by 50% or more. And it's important that we continue to do what the RFS was put in place to do, which is to continue to use more of them while we continue to use diesel equipment.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Certainly, the more efficient car on the road today is part of what explains why gasoline demand is much lower today than it was when this program was created. When the program was created, it was premised on the estimate of today about 160 billion gallons of gasoline use, which is why there was no concern of the blend wall back then. Today, we're about 142, 143 billion gallons, which is what is causing the root cause of the problem is there's no place for the ethanol to go once the blend wall is reached right around 14.2, 0.3 billion gallons of ethanol. That's the root cause of the problem. That's why fundamentally this program needs to be reformed.
Okay.
I guess I'd just like to say that I realize in the future higher octane fuels are going to be used for the engines designed for better efficiencies, and I think the one advantage to the ethanol industry is to grow the blend rate to a higher blend, and mainly because of the Clean Air Act and the benefits of ethanol and the less greenhouse gas emissions created from ethanol. So I think it'd be down the road, higher blends of ethanol will help with the higher octane engines and also the environment.
I'd be interested in hearing what you believe should be done to address the implementation of the statute while protecting the interest of small refiners from disproportionate harm, as Congress had envisioned. Anybody want to start that? Yes, Mr. Thompson?
We would say that, again, last year, and frankly, for the last couple of years, we have been working with Congressman Shimkus about such an alternative, which is why we supported the concept of moving away from the RFS, the command and control approach, into a 95 RON approach, which we believe would be better for all stakeholders, for the biofuel industry, for the auto industry, makes for a more efficient automobile, for consumers and certainly refiners. We believe if we transitioned away to a performance-based standard, right, that would be better for small refiners because it's the compliance cost of the program that is causing the hardship, not the use of ethanol in and of itself.
Anyone else?
Sure. This really isn't very complicated on the existing RFS side. The law is extremely straightforward. At this point in the program, advanced biofuels are supposed to be making up the vast majority of the program's growth. The SREs are have clearly caused that not only to stop but to start to retrench. We don't have to look any farther than the data that AFPM has put up there earlier and keeps pointing to. That data clearly makes my point. The expansion should be happening in the advanced biofuels sector now. It's not because the SREs. We need to have a light shined on what's happening in the SRE program.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Delaware, Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester, for 5 minutes to question.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member Shimkus. And I want to thank the panel for your testimony today. All of the panelists have raised concerns about how the RIN market is functioning. And so I have one two-part question to each member of the panel. And in the interest of time, you'll each get about a minute to answer this one two-part question. Do you think the RIN market has functioned properly throughout the lifetime of the RFS program? And if you do think there is a problem with the RIN market, how has it affected your business or industry? And we'll start with Mr. Cooper.
Well, thank you for the question, and I will try to answer briefly. I think the answer to whether the RIN market has functioned properly relies upon was EPA enforcing the RVOs. And when they were enforcing the RVOs that were finalized annually, yes, the RIN market was doing its job. It was helping to expand and grow the market and provide the incentive to do that. When EPA is not enforcing or implementing the program properly, the RIN market does not function properly. And then secondly, I think the lack of transparency in the RIN market, which has been brought up a few times today, is absolutely an impediment to the effective operation of that market. And that's something that I know the legislation we're discussing here today would help address.
Great, thank you. Sir?
Yeah, the fundamental logic of the RIN component of the RFS makes perfect sense. And theoretically, it should work perfectly fine, and largely does when there's open access to information. But when some participants in a market have more information than others, markets don't function properly. The fundamental structure of the RIN market makes sense, the fundamental logic of the RFS makes sense, but it all is dependent on EPA administering the program such that all market participants have the same amount of information at the same time.
Great. Yes, sir. Mr. Thompson.
We certainly don't believe the RIN market has operated as envisioned. At the time the program was enacted, RINs were supposed to be a minor transactional cost. As we all know, that is not the case today. It's created great hardship for not only small refineries, but all refineries. Now, as far as to some of the testimony that the biofuel industry believes there needs to be higher RINs to drive demand, simply not true. Analysis after analysis shows zero correlation between RIN prices and D6 RIN prices and ethanol consumption. Zero correlation, and only a weak correlation as it relates to biodiesel. So the assertion that you need high RIN prices, there's only one thing that high RIN prices do, two things. Creates hardship for the refining industry and more expensive fuel for consumers.
Thank you. Mr. Neuenhuizen.
I believe the RIN market has worked successfully with the RFS. It's a pass-through cost to the refineries. If they meet their obligations, they recoup the price. But also in our situation at Siouxland Energy, we produce about 2 million gallons a year of cellulosic ethanol through cell-based, corn fiber-based ethanol. And the D3 RIN values help promote that project to create some cellulosic ethanol with our corn fiber. So I do think it's been a successful part of the RFS.
Thank you so much, and I would also agree with Mr. Walden. This is one of the complex issues that this committee has to deal with, so thank you for your testimony and thank you for your leadership.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes a gentleman from West Virginia, Representative McKinley,
Thank you, Mr.
for
Chairman.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Mr. Walden for giving up his slot so that I could ask this question. The biofuel industry argues that granting hardship exemptions to small refineries, boutique refineries like Argonne in Newell, West Virginia, which produces 23,000 barrels a day. And they say if we grant that exemption, it will be, quote, demand destruction, is what I'm hearing from the biofuels. Now, let's put this in context. That may sound like a lot of production, 23,000 barrels, but Marathon produces over 3 million barrels a day, 130 times what Argonne's producing. So there's a reason for these exemptions for small refineries that were put into Clean Air Act, and it's been upheld by the courts. It was for facilities just like Argonne. I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter letters of record from the labor organizations which support these small refinery exemptions and oppose the RFS, from the steel workers, the plumbers and pipe fitters, the Boilermakers, the IBEW, Northwest Building Trades, the National Building Trades, and the AFPM, organizations that say we should do this. Now, EIA data that Mr. Thompson, you brought up, shows that the ethanol production and blending has gone up to record highs. So even when these exemptions have been granted that they say were so sinister in the last 2 years plus, when do you think biofuels will be able to compete in an open market without a mandate?
It's a difficult question. I'll say when they become, more, at least from the biodiesel side, when they become more cost competitive, frankly, right? It's 75 to $1 more expensive on a gallon basis of biodiesel than the diesel that my members produce. Ethanol is cost effective right now, and like I said, ethanol is being used. Back to the data, it's being used. So this isn't a fight. We're not anti-ethanol. We're anti-mandates, and we're anti-programs that are trying to smother our small refineries.
Let me follow up with a second question with you. The legislation we're talking about today would require the release of proprietary business information. Is the intent of the bill, in effect, to keep small refineries from filing these hardship petitions? And is that workable?
Well, it sure seems that way, as I talked about in my opening remarks, because you create this Hobson's choice, as I said, for refiners who are going to be asked to put their most sensitive information into the public. There's no more competitive market in this country than it is for motor gasoline. Asking a small refinery to put all their financial data and then make it publicly available certainly plays right into that competition. It's not something that most small refineries would welcome, and I think what it would do would chill refineries from seeking such relief.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, did I get unanimous consent? You certainly did. Thank you, and I appreciate that. Back to you, Mr. Cooper, as we close out on my time questioning, let me just clarify. You said several times when you didn't answer Congressman Shimkus' question that it was going to take a long time. The Green New Deal says by 2030. Is 9 years, 10 years, is that a long time?
I think everyone who has looked at how this transition to electric vehicles could play out from a very analytical standpoint knows it's going to take more than 10 years.
But that's what they're pushing on it is 10-year window, and the presidential candidates have all been embracing that. They think that's a great idea, and I think that Congressman Pallone's offer is another alternative to change that to 2050. Again, we've heard from some other folks from the Department of Energy in the previous administration with Moniz and others have said that's not workable to be able to think about. Even 2050, it can't work. So I just want to make sure that you understand, I'm aware of the time frame, and I don't think even by 2050 we're going to be ready. The devastation it's going to do to our country is incredible. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, full committee chair, for 5 minutes to ask questions. Please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Let me just ask Mr. Jabolis if I'm pronouncing it right. Your company has been in business for about 20 years, a little longer than the RFS program has existed. And the original RFS granted a blanket exemption for small refineries for several years in the beginning of the program. And when the blanket exemption in the law expired, EPA continued to approve some small refinery exemptions virtually every year. In your testimony, you say that recently you've had to close 3 facilities. So my question is, has this type of setback happened in past years when there were fewer small refinery exemptions?
Thank you for the question. As you point out, in the early days of the RFS, there were waivers given as of right, and then subsequently extensions of those. Starting around 2012, companies had to apply for the waivers, and there were only a few given. Some were 7, 8, totaling about 200 million gallons annually. Those were relatively modest. They didn't substantially change the markets. In the early going, they didn't change markets at all because they were the waived gallons were picked up by other obligated parties. Only starting 15, 18 months ago, with the very significant expansion of the waiver program, did it show up in decreased RIN values, which go directly to our economics and our ability to produce.
All right, but in your testimony, you said that one of your products is sustainable aviation fuel, and last week we had a hearing on the transportation sector with a representative, Nestle, who talked about the need to increase demand for this fuel if we're to lower climate pollution from the aviation sector. So let me just ask a couple questions. Are we going to get new investment in alternative fuels without the RFS?
It makes it very difficult. As I was pointing out earlier, we're investing in California because California is investing in California. With the signals that we're getting out of the EPA, it makes it very difficult to invest. Not only does it chill demand in the moment, it makes it very hard to project forward an environment in which we can justify investments today that will have to pay out over time.
And this because the EPA continues to grant large number of exemptions, or what is it?
For us, directly so. I think there's been a lot of quoting of studies one way or the other. There's absolutely zero question that the small refinery exemptions are killing demand in biodiesel and advanced biofuels.
And so, what kind of signals is this, implementation of the RFS sent to the investment community with respect to advanced biofuels, essentially?
Well, it's not a positive one.
Okay. Can I ask Mr. Cooper and Mr. Neuwenhuis, about the same topic, if you want to express your views? Mr.
Certainly.
Cooper?
Thank you for the question, and I guess I would respond by really challenging what you've heard from Mr. Thompson regarding demand destruction in the ethanol industry. We absolutely have experienced demand loss in the ethanol industry as a consequence of these small refinery exemptions, and the signal that sends to the industry is, hey, stop investing. If there's not going to be a market for larger volumes of renewable fuels, we're not going to invest in expanding capacity. As I said in my testimony, 2018 consumption was about 150 to 200 million gallons lower than it was in 2017. That's the first time in more than 20 years that we saw a year-over-year loss in ethanol consumption. And now this year, EIA is saying actual consumption is likely to be about 500 million gallons lower than they initially projected. So there absolutely has been demand destruction in the ethanol side as well. And we expect that to accelerate now that we have another 31 exemptions that came out in August. Mr. Thompson's slide showed everything going through July. Well, what about the impact of these 31 waivers that were announced after?
I think I got 20 seconds left, Mr. Neuwenhuis, if you want to say something.
The August 9th, 31 small refinery exemptions really crushed the ethanol market and crushed the prices, and that's when the bottom fell out of our industry. And our local plant that I'm president of the board, like I talked about our capital projects, so we're actually doing a capital call to our initial shareholders right now, and to raise some cash to keep the plant running. So these small refinery exemptions have done a lot of damage, not only to the ethanol demand, but also to the investment side of things and the fear of not having the certainty of an RFS that's being upheld.
All right, thank you. Thank you all.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, full committee ranking member, for 5 minutes to ask questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks to the panel, and as you've heard, some of us have had hearing upstairs and this one as well, but we appreciate your information. So I just have one question to start with for everybody on the panel. I think businesses generally would have a problem with a blanket statement that anything submitted to the government that was unique to their operations competitive position should be given to the general public, right? So my question, does that seem reasonable to each of you? And kind of a yes or no if you can. Mr. Cooper?
Yes, I think we're not suggesting that refineries should turn over private financial or operational data to the public. Nobody's asking for that. Names of the refineries and their locations, even EPA has said that's not confidential business information and should be publicly available.
All right, let me work down the panel here.
So a company chooses to seek an exemption. I cannot fathom why it doesn't make sense for that company to reveal who they are, where they are, and why they are seeking the exemption.
Right. Mr. Thompson?
Again, I've made it clear, we certainly don't support that. Something Mr. Cooper said, that no one's asking for that to be the case. Unfortunately, that's what H.R. 3006 says directly, that any information submitted as a part of the waiver application shall be deemed to be available for public disclosure.
All right.
Now, even the name of a company can hurt you, given that all fuel markets are regional and very competitive. Even the people knowing you got one and that your distress could put you at even further distress.
All right.
Yeah, I realize the SREs are part of the RFS, and it's designed for the small refineries, and and they're supposed to show a hardship. So unless you know who they are, how are they going to show that they're actually suffering a hardship from the RFS? So I think the SREs or the HR 3006 is very important going forward for transparency.
All right, thank you all. Mr. Gabolis and Mr. Cooper, for many years I've been promoting policies to increase the use of woody biomass in our environmental policies, given the great forest stocks we have and the need to thin out our forests and trying to figure out markets to pay for all that. So I recently visited an innovative project in Lakeview, Oregon, where Red Rock Biofuels is constructing a gasification facility. Now that will turn woody biomass into jet and diesel fuel, and they already have contracts. This is the first gasification project in the world to use woody biomass from forest thinning and related activities. It may serve as a blueprint for producing advanced renewable biodiesel and at the same time help keep forests healthy and more resilient to these awful wildfires we've been having. So I understand it already has contracts with Southwest Airlines, FedEx, and DoD. One problem is, due to RFS and tax credit prohibitions, the project cannot take biomass from federal lands or wood chips from the local mill. Yet there's no way to determine whether the chips are from federal or private land since its source is from both. So from your perspective, what are the prospects that innovative projects like this can provide additional fuel sources for biodiesel and transportation fuels, and what will be the impact on greenhouse gas emissions? Do either of you want to comment?
I can't speak to that particular project, but in general, the way innovation happens is that there are market signals set, and then companies compete to respond to those. And so whether it's the project that you refer to or the project that we're doing in Los Angeles or projects that are happening throughout the country, that is what the RFS was meant to do. It was meant to drive innovation. It was meant to push forward. And so I can't speak to the particular.
Well, you can come out and visit, and then you could. We'd be happy to. Anybody wants to come out to Lakeview, we'll take you. Mr. Cooper?
I would say that, the issue we're talking about today, small refinery exemptions, have absolutely dampen the incentive to invest in the type of innovation that you're talking about as well. We've talked a lot about the impacts on first-generation biofuels, corn ethanol, soybean-based biodiesel. But when EPA issues an SRE, it affects every category of the RFS. We've seen lower cellulosic RIN prices and therefore lower investment in those technologies as well.
All right. Again, thank you all for helping us better understand the issues today and those that lie ahead in this big issue set. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Representative Soto, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is part of our historic set of hearings to try to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, to have a clean climate act for the 21st century. So when I hear that we can't get to clean energy by 2050, I worry that our nation's in deep trouble and our world is in deep trouble if we can't do that. I just got an analysis the other day by the Union of Concerned Scientists about the rise in extreme heat in my district in Central Florida from 4 days a year to 141 by the end of the century if we don't do anything. Coupled with extreme weather and rising seas, obviously this is something that we're concerned about. For this particular hearing, how many of you all, and we'll go down the list, agree that the RFS lowers greenhouse gas emissions overall? We'll start from left to right. Do you agree or disagree?
I agree 100%.
There's no question about it.
I agree there is reductions in greenhouse gas emissions.
I agree 100%.
Thanks. We want to at least establish basic facts as we're going forward on these issues. Overall, how many of you agree that these applications should remain secret or be in the sunshine? I come from a state where everything's a public record unless you get an exemption, the state of Florida. So let's go down the list, and then I had some particular questions for Mr. Thompson to try to get at what may be common ground. But from left to right, how many of you agree that these should still be totally secret or not?
I believe that basic information about the petitioner should be revealed to the public. The name, identity, location of the refinery should absolutely be available to the public.
The SEC requires that companies report material financial information, and because of that, we know some of who has pursued these, including Chevron, Exxon, and others.
Now, is that comprehensive, or we just know, we get sort of a glimmer of some companies that are doing it, but not all of them?
We get what they deem to be material and what they share under SEC rules. At least the name, the location, and the volume has got to be the bare minimum.
Sure. Mr. Thompson, I know you had mentioned just merely disclosing the hardship is an adverse consequence. We have obviously SEC where you have to disclose earnings and other things that companies have to do all the time. What could be disclosed, or is your position that nothing should be disclosed because you're admitting a hardship?
Well, let me just start by answering your first question,
Sure.
which is, I think the application should remain confidential. Let's use the correct words.
Sure.
Not secret. Confidential, as long as the applicant desires them to remain confidential. By the way, this is the exact same policies under the Trump administration. I mean, the Obama administration. Exact same. And they were kept confidential pursuant to CBI regulations that EPA must adhere to.
But we have a lot of new
This information can jeopardize the competitive standing of organizations. It's always been treated as confidential.
Well, we're here today because it's the opinion of the committee that it could be abused right now, that we're seeing a bunch of new applications being sent forward, and we have no way to determine whether or not they should have it. So just the sheer identification of it, you are opposed to.
I would
because
say
you
that
think
what
it'll give a
EPA did
hardship.
recently with their website, in which they announced the applications, how many are granted, how many volumes, how many RINs, I think that's a step in the right direction. And by the way, one last thing, there's no shortage of lawsuits filed by folks around me related to SREs. Obviously, this information is getting out in some quarters.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Unionized.
Yeah, I'd like to say I think these SREs need to be 100% transparent. Speaking from a farmer's perspective, who over the last 37 years, we've had farm subsidies, and everybody knows that. But everybody sitting in this room can go online and find out how much my family has received from farm subsidies. And so I don't see where the small refinery exemptions should be different than what agriculture has to deal with.
Sure, so
and
you
so
all-
I think 100% transparency in SREs is necessary.
So you all, in effect, are admitting as farmers too, having a hardship and needing that help, and we want you to have that help. Those programs are in place. So there's other industries that have to admit when they may need a little help from the government, and that hasn't put you under, has it?
But one thing I will say is the farming industry, we want to move away from subsidies. We want markets. We've been working on this for years. The biofuels industry has been the best thing that ever happened to my farming career, and I want to see it to continue to grow and give us markets so we don't need farm subsidies.
Well, that's actually having an actual trade policy on China and getting USMCA in for a landing, but that's for the Ways and Means Committee, so thanks for being here.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Flores. Flores, are you next?
Yes.
For 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. To all our witnesses, I've asked this question before, particularly last December when Chairman Shimkus and I had a hearing on this. Which of these two options would you prefer? Option A, keep the status quo and let the regulatory agencies decide what annual RFS compliance is, or option B, come up with a legislative solution to fix these concerns. Mr. Cooper, option A or option B?
We would prefer that EPA enforce the law that Congress gave it.
Mr. Jabolis?
The same answer.
Okay, Mr. Thompson?
B.
Okay. Mr. Neuenhaus?
I prefer that the RFS stay intact and we do it the way it's been done.
Is that option A?
No.
That's not option A. So that's an option C then, I guess. Mr. Cooper, you seemed to hedge when I asked you that question last December. You did state, however, that there are things that could be improved with the current program, and the EPA does have the administrative authority to make those fixes. Since that hearing last December, does your organization still prefer constant litigation of these RFS battles in the administration and courts, or would you prefer a legislative solution?
We still believe that the administration can resolve these issues with EPA's administrative authority. It just requires the will to do so, and that's what we're focused on currently.
To my next question, I imagine that liquid fuel powered vehicles will face increased competition from electric and hybrid vehicles in the years ahead. So the questions are this: do you agree that liquid fuel vehicles will have to find ways to improve fuel economy and lower emissions? And B, do you believe that that a high octane standard is the most effective way to improve the fuel economy of liquid fuel powered vehicles? Mr. Cooper?
Yes, I do believe there's a tremendous role for high-octane fuel vehicles to improve efficiency and reduce emissions moving forward.
Okay, so yes to both questions. And
Yes.
then Mr. Jabolis.
Yeah, obviously the world's changing and we're going to get to greater and greater efficiency and the liquid fuels market's going to have to change with it.
Do you feel that high-octane standards are a way to achieve that?
I don't have an opinion on that one way or the other.
Okay, Mr. Thompson.
Certainly, we believe there's a lot of potential, and as you know, when transitioning away from the RFS to a 95 RON standard, we believe that would be in the best interest of all stakeholders.
Okay. Mr. Neuenhaus, do you agree that liquid fuel vehicles are going to have to find ways to improve fuel economy and lower emissions?
Yeah, absolutely, and
Okay.
I feel the best way is through high-octane fuels with ethanol blends.
Okay, well, I think you all supported the approach that Mr. Shimkus and I are trying to take versus the constant litigation and arguing with the EPA. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Representative Matsui, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for bringing attention to one out of the many issues that come out of this administration's handling of the renewable fuel standard. While many of us were excited about the promise of the RFS and the opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our nation's transportation sector, it's been clear for the past 2.5 years that it's not in the interest of this administration to execute the program as Congress intended, and abundantly obvious that the ultimate goal of the RFS to combat climate change is not one shared by the president or his political appointees. A critical issue that has been gaining attention lately is a liberal use of the small refinery exceptions, SREs, and how they are not only undercutting the program, but hurting industries across the country, including Pacific Ethanol, which is headquartered in my district of Sacramento. I met with Pacific Ethanol CEO, who's communicated to me firsthand how SREs are hurting his company and threatening good-paying jobs in my district. Now, I want to now turn to the subject of advanced biofuels. We have not seen the level of deployment of advanced fuels that was originally envisioned under the RFS. Where we can point to issues that have come up over the years, it's also clear that difference in missions between this administration and the last is having an impact here. For example, the EPA under President Trump has put a freeze on all new cellulosic biofuel registrations and pathways. Mr. Cooper or Mr. J. how has this freeze impacted the ability to deploy a higher percentage of advanced biofuels, specifically cellulosic biofuels, into our fuel mix? And if you could be quick, make it quickly.
Well, yeah, thank you for the question. Pacific Ethanol is actually one of the leaders in adopting cellulosic ethanol technology, and they are today producing cellulosic ethanol right alongside starch-based ethanol. We have 200 corn-based ethanol plants across the country. Every one of them was in a position to quickly adopt the same technology to produce cellulosic biofuels that would reduce carbon emissions 70 to 80% relative to gasoline. But as you mentioned, EPA put a freeze on those registrations, put a freeze on those pathway petitions, and so today we have maybe half a dozen facilities that are using that technology. So EPA's mismanagement of the RFS goes far beyond the small refinery exemptions and also deals with these pathway approvals and registrations.
Well, has the increase in approval of SREs impacted the development of cellulosic biofuels and their ability to penetrate the market? Either one of you?
Yeah, I can't speak to cellulosic, although it has.
Okay.
But more directly, by far the largest advanced biofuel in the country is biodiesel and biomass-based diesel. And the impact on biomass-based diesel has been severe and immediate. All of the expansion in the RFS is supposed to be in the advanced biofuel sector as of 2016, and we have flatlined despite the fact that the basic concept of the RFS was that the program would be emphasizing advanced biofuels, all of which have a 50% greater reduction in carbon impact.
So an issue that's come up as this year's rulemaking has unfolded is whether or not and in what volume the waived gallons of renewable fuel might be incorporated back into the market by requiring refineries that did not receive a waiver to blend additional gallons. Mr. Cooper, would H.R. 3006 June 1st deadline for small refinery exemption petitions address this issue?
Yes, it would on a prospective basis moving forward. I think the 4 billion gallons that we've lost already as a consequence of these exemptions would not be addressed by the legislation, but it would stop the bleeding and ensure that moving forward, those exemptions, which we're saying, if a small refiner deserves one, go ahead and give it to them. Just make sure that lost blending volume is made up and accounted for by larger non-exempt refineries. Okay. The bill would do that.
All right. Well, should there be additional public transparency milestones, such as a deadline for EPA to report to the public how many petitions they have received? Is that helpful?
Yes, that would be helpful.
Okay. What other information could be made public that is not currently available?
I think, as we've discussed, we think the identity of the refinery submitting a petition, the volume, that is seeking an exemption, and the location of the refinery. Those are three basic things that are not confidential business information and don't involve financial or operational factors.
How about the criteria EPA uses to evaluate these petitions?
It would be very helpful to know exactly what criteria EPA is using and how that's changed.
So you want more transparency all the way around?
Certainly.
Okay, fine. I've run out of time, so thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you.
The gentle lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've just got a couple questions. Mr. Thompson, under the RFS, are waivers allowed?
Yes.
They are allowed?
Waivers, yes.
Yes, okay. Are there court cases to back this up?
Absolutely. Yes, there are lots of court cases, including several that deal specifically with small refinery exemptions.
So the president is within his authority to be able to do this, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's pretty much all my questions. With that, I yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Buddy Carter.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Gentlemen, can you clear something up for me. Mr. Thompson, you said in your testimony that the data, the EIA data, says that both volume and blend rates for ethanol are at a near all-time high. But I've heard you, Mr. Cooper, and you, Mr. Neuenhuis, say that they've decreased. I'm confused. Who's right here, who's wrong? Mr. Cooper, you want to take a shot at it?
Absolutely. I'm not sure what EIA data Mr. Thompson's looking at. The data we look at shows clear evidence of demand loss. We are consuming less ethanol last year than we have in 2017. That's the first year-over-year loss we've seen.
And are you saying that the SREs are the reason for that?
They are certainly part of the reason for that, yes.
How much of the reason for that? I mean, and why?
We would suggest that SREs are primarily responsible for that demand loss. Because you have reduced...
Okay, because...
You've reduced the requirement, the RFS requirement. You've lowered that below the so-called E10 blend wall and taken the pressure off the marketplace to expand ethanol blending.
Okay, Mr. Thompson, what?
The only data that I have is from the EIA, and the EIA data, which again was on display, is pulled right from their website. It's the latest data available publicly. It's only available up through July of this year, and it shows that ethanol blend rates are at 10.17%, which is the highest of all time. It shows that biodiesel consumption is certainly slightly down by it looks like 4,000 or so gallons. And so, as far as there, I have proof for my data point.
Okay, well, I'm not doubting you. I'm just a little bit confused.
You're doubting me. I'm suggesting I have no way to refute the data that just happens to fall in their testimony.
Okay.
Right? This is the
Fair enough.
It speaks for itself.
Fair enough. Well, let me ask you this: Would the SREs impact the ethanol more so than biofuels, or would it be the same for both?
Yeah,
Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson?
Well, I would say that there's probably more of an impact on biodiesel than ethanol because, as we say, my members make blends, bobs that have to be blended with octane before they can be sold, and that octane source is ethanol. So regardless of SREs, remember, SREs only give relief from compliance of handing over RINs to the government. It does not give them relief from making sure that they're selling to consumers a compliant product.
Okay, gotcha. Mr. Cooper?
Well, again, we could, and we have been arguing for quite some time about what the EIA data show. When you look at the facts on the ground, though, we have 19 ethanol plants that have shut down. You can't tell me that hasn't happened because there hasn't been some loss of demand. And that's absolutely what has occurred. Our production is down. That's a response to the lower demand that we've seen as well.
Okay, all right, fine, enough. Let me ask you this. I'm going to shift gears, and Mr. Thompson, I'm going to ask you this. You said in your testimony that the RFS is explicit in providing small refineries the ability to apply for a petition at any point in the year. How important is that to be flexible? I know that we've had a number of floods in the Midwest, and certainly that had to have had some impact on it as well.
Well, you hit it on its head. There's lots of circumstances that can arise. Again, it was Congress. If you go back and look at the legislative history around SREs, it goes back to the early 2000s. It was bipartisan. These small refineries are the lifebloods of communities. You want to protect them and make sure they remain viable. And so there are things that can crop up at any time in the year that can impact the ability to comply, and refineries should have the ability and the flexibility to seek relief when they need relief.
Very good. And I'm going to yield to Ranking Member Shimkus.
Well, I thank my colleague. The point I want to stress is, and whether you want to dispute this or not, is that the volume of the liquid transportation fleet based upon Energy Information Agency is going to decline. Well, how fast, how slow? If we move to a Green New Deal, it's going to be rapid, and it's going to be based upon intervention by us, regulations, and rules. So we're trying to protect the liquid transportation market, and we have to rewrite the law. And that's what I was trying to do, and I need your help. I'll yield back to my colleague.
And I yield the remainder of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yield back, and now the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, I thank the chairman, and I thank the witnesses. I apologize for missing your testimony, but this is a complicated issue, and I appreciate there's a lot of different sides to it. My district has Pacific Ethanol, which produces 60 million gallons a year, so it is important to me. Mr. Cooper, in your testimony, you mentioned how the response to sustained or weak negative margins, trends that coincide with the Trump administration's expansion of the SRE program, that ethanol plants have been forced to idle or shut down permanently. Can you speak to the impact that this has had on the biofuel producers, specifically with regard to both the direct and indirect jobs associated with those losses?
Certainly, and thank you for the question. Yes, as I mentioned, we've seen 19 ethanol plants either temporarily idle or permanently closed. There's 4 or 5 of those facilities that have shut their doors and will never come back online. The jobs, each of those ethanol plants employs 45 to 50 workers directly at the plant. Those are great jobs in rural areas typically. But the impact goes far beyond that. There's lots of indirect and induced jobs. We have estimated the impact of these 19 plant closures as 700 lost direct jobs and 2,800 indirect and induced jobs. That's about 3,500 jobs that we believe have been affected because of these small refinery exemptions. It's a serious issue. We're also experiencing the worst margins for a sustained period of time that this industry has probably ever seen.
Thank you. Mr. Gaboilis, one of the biggest complaints surrounding how the EPA has managed the SRE program is that there's been a lack of transparency. That's come up several times this morning. And with these waivers that's being granted, who's receiving them? Would you say that all the secretive and capricious nature of the SREs can have a destabilizing effect on the renewable energy sector, specifically with regard to ethanol production and job loss?
There's no question that the secretive nature destabilizes markets. Some market participants have information, others don't. You can't have a functioning market like that. If I might just quickly add to your previous question to Mr. Cooper, look, we can quote all the studies we want. I had to make a decision to close 3 plants. I couldn't personally be in 3 places at the same time, so I had to do those by video. One after another, even through video, I made eye contact with the folks that were going to be furloughed later that same day. There is zero question that these SREs are crushing small refiners. They're just biorefiners.
Thank you. Mr. Nunhaus, can you speak to the impact of the EPA's decision to not fully reallocate the negotiated amount of 1.3 billion gallons of SREs in 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. The deal that we were approached with on October 4th from the Trump administration was to add back our 3-year rolling average of the gallons that were actually waived, of the 4.04 billion gallons. So that would be like 1.4 billion gallons per year on a 3-year thing. No, there was some certainty in that proposal. But the proposal that the EPA came out with 11 days later cut that in half. And that didn't even assure that the waivers that they granted wouldn't offset that to keep us under 15 billion gallons. So as president of a board of a plant, when we heard the first proposal, we were excited. And then when we heard the actual proposal from the EPA, we were disappointed and saw that that wasn't going to be the answer to the situation.
Yeah, businesses thrive on certainty and predictability, and this is, in my opinion and many people's opinion, a real problem. Mr. Cooper, you noted in your testimony that while the practice of issuing retroactive exemptions has continued since 2013, they only emerge as a significant concern under the Trump administration's massive expansion. Can you speak to the importance of closing this loophole?
Absolutely, and again, this program, the small refinery exemption program has been around since the beginning of the RFS. It hasn't really been an issue for us until the last few years, when the refining industry did find numerous loopholes available in this program and exploited those loopholes and had a willing partner in EPA. So we do think there's a number of ways to close those loopholes. We believe HR 3006 begins to close some of those, the biggest loopholes, being the deadline for submitting these petitions, and ensuring that we know before the RVO is finalized every year what volume of gasoline and diesel is going to be exempted from an obligation. That allows that volume to be restored or redistributed to non-exempt parties. That's the big issue here.
Well, I mean, the EPA has the flexibility to deal with this. It's just using it in a bad way, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Representative Schakowsky, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. So the current issues surrounding the renewable fuel standard perfectly, in my mind, sums up the priorities of the Trump administration. President Trump and his cronies, they get theirs, while ordinary Americans get hurt. We saw this in 2014 when the Trump Taj Mahal Casino filed for bankruptcy only to be bailed out by billionaire Carl Icahn, who bought it. And when casino workers went on strike 2 years later, Icahn did everything he could to try to strip them of their pensions and bankrupt the casino to his benefit. And he is definitely, he is the definition of a vulture capitalist. Well, President Trump then rewarded Icahn with an advisory role in the White House. Icahn used his position to line up, to line his own pocket by pushing the EPA to overhaul the renewable fuel standard in order to benefit his own energy interests. And this administration is working overtime to promote big oil at the expense of farmers and rural communities and average Americans everywhere. What's worse is that they're afraid to admit it, resulting in a shameful lack of transparency. Mr. Cooper, would you say that anything that I said just now, this characterization, is incorrect?
Well, I would say the president on numerous occasions has voiced strong support for the ethanol industry and the RFS specifically, but the actions of his EPA and the actions of this administration are inconsistent with those commitments and promises.
Thank you. Mr. Neuenhuis, has the Trump administration given small refinery waivers to big companies like those Icahn has invested in, and put farmers' interests, or has it put farmers' interests first?
Well, from my perspective, it's put the oil industry's perspective first, and the farm or the rural communities have taken a lot of abuse through these small refinery exemptions. And part of the small refinery exemptions, when they started that discussion, was because of the cost of RINs, was the reason they were asking for the hardships. Well, August 9th, when they granted the last 31 small refinery exemptions, RIN prices were at an all-time record low. So we were shocked when those were granted, because we thought with record low RIN prices, why should anybody qualify for a hardship?
Thank you. So climate change has worsened disasters such as floods across the Midwest, where I live. This endangers the food security of Americans and the livelihood of our farmers. Illinois has the third highest ethanol production capacity in the United States. Again, I want to ask Mr. Neuenhuis, as a farmer, is there any evidence that Carl Icahn, when he was at the White House and the White House, has the best interest of Illinois farmers at heart?
Oh, absolutely not. He has best interest in his own pocketbook in that situation. He was calling for the change of point of obligation to start with, and he's been trying to destroy the RFS since the Trump administration got into office.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, what would the administration, what would what the administration has proposed, the changes that it's proposed to the renewable fuel standard mean to Illinois farmers in your view?
Well, as Kelly pointed out earlier, you know, the deal or the agreement that was promised to the biofuels industry was we're going to make whole the renewable fuel standard. We're going to make sure that in 2020, 15 billion gallons of required blending actually means 15 billion. And there was a methodology for doing that that involved a 3-year rolling average of actual exemptions that Mr. Neuenhaus referred to. What we've seen in the proposal is that EPA has gone back on that agreement and is proposing to use a surrogate for projecting those exemptions that would result in the 15 billion gallon number, again, eroding to something less than 15 billion gallons and being inconsistent with what appears in the statute.
Mr. Cooper, I saw you shake your head when it was suggested that on the question of transparency, et cetera, that essentially that the Obama administration has just been exactly like the Trump administration. Could you speak to that?
I'd be happy to. In 2016, under the previous administration, EPA actually proposed, in a proposed rule that went out for public comment, to kind of lift the veil on the small refinery exemption program. And they actually said, you know, and I quote, that small refiners are not entitled to CBI protection for certain information, including the name and location of the refineries, the nature of the relief that was being sought, and the volumes affected. EPA tried to float that proposal out again recently, and it got withdrawn and pulled back. So it isn't consistent to say that the Obama administration had the exact same approach to transparency on this issue. They understood there was a problem and they were trying to resolve it.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the witnesses and the information you're providing. I'm a little disappointed at the narrow scope of this hearing. The whole issue of the ethanol mandate has raised a lot of policy questions, environmental, cost of food, impact on farmers who use grain. But I certainly appreciate the advocacy of friends like Mr. Loebsack, who are really concerned about the well-being of the farmers that grow grain that goes in, corn that goes into ethanol. And I come from a dairy state where grain is feed. And there's a lot of evidence that the ethanol mandate, there used to be a tax benefit, and there used to be, as you know, a tariff. All of that added to the cost of the dairy farmers who were paying more for the corn. So there's a dilemma here. Okay, we like farmers, but if you're a corn producer, you like the ethanol mandate. If you're a corn consumer, for your dairy cows, it's a lot tougher. And I've been working with Mr. Flores and others to try to deal with some of these problems and get some stability. And I want to just ask, so I just need to say that there's an immense amount of evidence that as a result of the ethanol policy, in fact, I disagree with your all raising your hand. We're creating more greenhouse gases net than without it. There's an enormous amount of evidence about overproduction, row-to-row, a lot more planting, millions of acres and the loss of habitat life, and then higher costs for consumers if they're buying their food, and higher costs for farmers that are using grain, whether it's dairy, chicken, or hogs. So in full disclosure here, I love farmers, but I don't necessarily love ethanol. Let me ask just a couple of questions to get this moving. With the status of this confusion between EPA and everything you're talking about, what specifically, Mr. Neuhaus, do you think has to be done to address this?
Well, I think the RFS needs to be upheld also on this situation, and on the small refinery exemptions, you know, it's been excessive during the Trump administration, the 4 billion gallons that have been granted waivers. And, you know, that was a lot
So
of demand.
transparency and a limitation on waivers.
Transparency and limitation
Okay.
would be huge.
All right. And Mr. Gabolis, did I pronounce your name right? The Greener Fuels Act, which I support, supports advanced biofuels. And that, as I understand it, is what the RFS was originally intended for. Can the RFS, as it is now, get us to a broader demand and use of advanced biofuels? And what are the major reforms to the program needed to achieve this goal?
Thanks very much for the question. The response is absolutely the RFS, as it is currently constructed, is not an ethanol mandate. It is a broad biofuels pushing structure that was designed to start with conventional biofuels, get to a maximum of 15 billion gallons of ethanol by 2016, and then all of the growth after that is designed to be in the advanced category.
But it's not there.
I'm sorry?
We're not getting it.
We're not getting it because we're getting SREs instead. I see Mr. Thompson react to my comment, but that is absolutely what is happening. There's an economist at the University of Illinois named Scott Irwin.
Right.
He's written a paper in March of this most recent year that lays it out in 3 very easily read pages on exactly how that is impacting us.
And without having an argument about the net carbon impact of ethanol, there's no question that advanced biofuels have a much more significant carbon reduction impact. Would you speak to that, Mr. Gabolis?
Yeah, you can't be in advanced biofuels unless you demonstrate without any question that your fuel reduces carbon by no less than 50%. In the biodiesel world, many of ours, depending on what you're using for feedstock, reduce the carbon impact by upwards of 85%. The other thing that I wanted to address is the issue about food versus fuel. The reason that soybeans, which are the main source of feedstock for biodiesel, the reason those are grown is for the protein, not the oil. And when you get a higher net back to the oil, the protein actually becomes less expensive. You get more value in the bean from the oil contribution, and the protein, which is the good stuff, actually becomes less expensive. So the growth of advanced biofuels actually goes hand in hand with the growth of protein.
Okay. I yield back. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Representative Lobenstein, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member Shimkus, for allowing me to wave on to the subcommittee, and thank you to the witnesses for being here as well. The RFS does support, as we know, thousands of jobs across the country. It's an economic driver in many rural and farming communities in Iowa and across the Midwest. Unfortunately, over the past 3 years, this administration has undermined this program at every turn without providing a shred of transparency along the way. And today, dozens of these plants have shut down or halted production. Our farmers are feeling real pain watching their local economies disappear right along with their jobs. I'm proud to have championed the legislation we are discussing today, the Rfs Integrity Act, introduced by my colleague and fellow co-chair on the Biofuels Caucus, Colin Peterson, and co-sponsored by a number of Republicans as well. This much-needed legislation would increase transparency around these waivers and allow EPA to account for waived gallons when setting the RVO for the coming year. And I've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to go through them a little bit quickly, if I may. Mr. Cooper, why is it important that we know who is receiving these waivers, and also exactly how many gallons are being exempted before the RVO is set?
Well, thank you for the question, and it really comes down to accountability and fairness. I mean, transparency is necessary if we're going to have an accountable program. Again, we're not suggesting that private financial or operational or sensitive data should be disclosed, but certainly the name and location of the facility that is asking for an exemption should be publicly available.
How many gallons are being exempted before the RVO is set then?
So far, I mean, the last few years, it's been an average of 1.35 billion gallons. Okay. We're simply asking EPA to add that into their RVO moving forward to make sure it's accounted for.
So does the current proposed rule guarantee 15 billion gallons?
It doesn't, because EPA is proposing to only project 770 million gallons of exemptions when the actual total has been 1.35 billion gallons. So
And
about
can you address how the market has responded to the supplemental rule and whether the current proposal will circumvent the closure of more ethanol plants?
The market has barely blinked at the supplemental proposal from EPA. RIN prices have remained low. Corn prices, ethanol prices did not react. And I think that's a pretty strong signal that the market doesn't see this as a proposal that's really going to put the RFS back on the right track.
Thanks, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Neuenhaus, thank you for being here. It's good to see you again. I see you in Iowa from time to time. Too bad we don't have the Corn Indy 300 any longer, but at any rate, thank you for being here. I think it's just so important that we hear directly from an Iowa farmer about the consequences of these waivers. How did the most recent batch of SREs play into your decision to close down your ethanol plant? And I'm happy that at least it's going at least to some capacity now.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Loebsack. The August 9th announcement of the 31 last SREs being granted, ethanol prices dropped 18 to 20 cents a gallon in a couple days. That's a huge move in the ethanol market. And it just knocked the wind out of our sails in our plant at Sioux Center at that point. The month of August, we lost millions of dollars. If we'd had a crystal ball and knew this was going to happen, we probably would have idled our plant sooner, did not drive it off a cliff.
And so if I might, what was the local impact of this?
When we idled our plant, it's a trickle-down effect. We not only weren't producing ethanol, but we weren't producing we produced 350,000 tons of wet distiller's grain in our plant alone every year. And it's all fed within a 3-county area with 2 cattle producers. It's a huge market for our co-product there. We weren't producing any corn oil, which we either use for livestock feed as a high-energy product, or it can go into biodiesel. Right. And then also the trucking industry. Our plant alone trucks in 24 million bushels of corn a year, and it trucks out 75 million gallons of ethanol a year.
And I think that those effects, those sort of forward and backward linkages, economists call them, right? I think that we often forget about those as well, that effect.
And our plant is unique also. We usually crack and pack 4 to 5 million bushels of corn during harvest, and we're not doing that this year.
So what about the effect on prices that farmers receive for their grain, their ability to deliver during the harvest?
You know what? It was huge. Our local location with our farmers, and we have 385 members to our plant, which are pretty much majority farmers. Them not being able to deliver corn there, and for us to take our bid off the tables is about a 15 to 20 cents a bushel drop in basis.
If Mr. Wheeler were here today, what would you say to him about the proposal?
Well, the latest proposal is woefully inadequate to give the certainty to our industry so we can move forward and grow the use of biofuels.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter the following item into record. It's a letter from the Biofuels Caucus, including my Iowa colleagues, Representatives Axney and Finkenauer, to EPA Administrator Wheeler. I request unanimous consent that I enter that into the record, if I could. The letter to Mr.
So granted.
Wheeler. Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I believe that concludes all members that were choosing.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask a point of personal privilege for 1 second? To all my friends here, I just want to go a little history. My first legislative success was enacting biodiesel in the fleets in 1998 with Karen McCarthy, and Clinton signed that bill. MTBE got excluded, ethanol found a market. I was in this room when we passed the RFS thanks to the then speaker. I voted for the Democratic 2007 RFS revision and expansion. I just want that on the record as I've been trying to deal in this very contentious debate. I think we're trying to find a solution. And I really would encourage my friends and my colleaes. I think we're threatened by a changing world, and we better get united. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I request unanimous consent to enter the following into the record. A letter from BIO, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, a letter from the United States Steelworkers, a letter from New Energy America, a letter from 25 members of Congress to EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, a Labor Coalition letter to EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, Labor Coalition for Biofuels, a set of letters from the labor community to the administration submitted by Representative McKinley, an article published in the New York Times Magazine entitled "Pale Oil Was Supposed to Help Save the Planet, Instead it Unleashed a Catastrophe," testimony from EPA Acting Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, Ann L. Itzel, a post from EIA's website, and finally a letter, I believe, from the Biofuel Caucus, and a letter from the coalition of many organizations that was received on dated September 10th. Without objection?
I think that went to the Senate. Was that?
It went to the Senate.
Without objection, so ordered. And finally, that concludes our business here. I would like to thank all of our witnesses for joining us at today's hearing. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days by which to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by our witnesses. I ask each witness to respond promptly to any such questions that they may receive. And with that, we again thank them for appearing before the subcommittee. And at this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.